What started as a routine late-night interview exploded into television chaos when Prince Harry faced off against Stephen Colbert in an unprecedented on-air meltdown that left audiences stunned and social media ablaze. The Late Show studio buzzed, with its usual pre-show energy as Prince Harry settled into the guest chair opposite Stephen Colbert. The Duke of Sussex had appeared relaxed during rehearsal, discussing his upcoming memoir updates and charitable initiatives. But the moment cameras rolled live, the atmosphere shifted dramatically when Colbert abandoned his prepared questions for something far more provocative. "Your Royal Highness," Colbert began with his trademark smirk, "let's talk about your recent comments regarding American veterans. Some people are saying you've been quite critical of our military while living comfortably in your Montecito mansion." Harry's expression immediately hardened. The question wasn't on the approved list his team had submitted, and it struck directly at his military service credentials, a topic he held sacred after 2 tours in Afghanistan. "I'm sorry, Stephen, but that's completely inaccurate," Harry replied, his voice steady but tension creeping in. "I've never criticized American veterans. In fact, through the Invictus Games, I've worked extensively with wounded warriors from your country." Colbert leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was creating. "But isn't it true that you compared American military culture unfavorably to British traditions during your Netflix interviews? Some veterans groups have expressed concern about your characterizations." The studio audience began to murmur as Harry shifted forward, his composure starting to crack. "That's a gross misrepresentation of what I said. I was speaking about institutional problems, not individual service members. I served my country for 10 years. "Right, but you also left that country," Colbert shot back with false sweetness. "Some might say you abandoned your military commitments when things got tough at home. Is that the kind of leadership you're teaching American veterans through your foundation?" The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Harry's knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrests of his chair. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged nervous glances, sensing the interview spiraling beyond their control. "You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," Harry said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I didn't abandon anything. I was forced out by a system that refused to protect my family from racist attacks and media harassment." Colbert's eyes lit up. He had found his target. "Ah, yes, the racism card. Very convenient when you need to explain away unpopular decisions. But here's what I find interesting, Harry. You lived in that supposedly racist institution for 35 years without complaint, until it became personally inconvenient." The studio fell silent except for the hum of television equipment. Harry's face flushed red as he processed what had just been said. The host had crossed a line that no professional interviewer should cross, making light of documented harassment that had driven his wife to suicidal thoughts. "Excuse me?" Harry's voice carried a sharp edge that made several audience members lean back in their seats. "Are you seriously suggesting that racism is something people make up for convenience?" Colbert shrugged theatrically. "I'm just asking questions, Your Highness. Isn't that what journalists do? Or are we only allowed to ask pre-approved softball questions when we're dealing with royalty?" The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Harry stood up slowly, his military bearing evident as he drew himself to full height. The movement sent a ripple of tension through the studio as cameras scrambled to adjust their angles. "You're not a journalist, Stephen," Harry said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "You're a comedian who thinks cruelty is funny. There's a difference." Colbert's smirk faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Oh, I see. So now we're attacking my profession? That's rich coming from someone whose only qualification for public speaking is being born into the right family." The insult landed like a physical blow. Harry had spent years fighting the perception that his achievements meant nothing because of his birth, working to prove himself through military service and charitable work. To have it thrown back at him so casually was devastating. "At least I earned my rank through service and sacrifice," Harry replied, his voice rising. "What have you earned except the right to mock people from behind a desk?" the audience began, to stir uncomfortably as the confrontation escalated beyond typical late-night banter. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was personal warfare being broadcast to millions. Colbert sensed he was losing control but doubled down instead of backing off. "Service and sacrifice? You mean flying helicopters while your security team did the real fighting? Come on, Harry, we both know your military career was as manufactured as your current celebrity status." The words hit Harry like shrapnel. His service in Afghanistan, where he had genuinely risked his life alongside his fellow soldiers, was being dismissed as a publicity stunt. The accusation was not just wrong. It was cruel to every person who had served alongside him. "You have no right," Harry said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "No right at all to diminish what my unit accomplished, or the sacrifices made by the men and women I served with." But Colbert wasn't finished. He had tasted blood and wanted more. "Let's talk about what really happened in Afghanistan," Colbert continued, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Because I've spoken to some military sources who paint a very different picture of your so-called heroic service. Word is, you spent most of your deployment playing video games in an air-conditioned bunker while real soldiers did the dangerous work." The studio audience gasped audibly. Even by late-night television standards, this was beyond acceptable. Harry's face went white, then red, as the implications of the accusation sank in. Colbert was essentially calling him a coward on national television. "That is an outright lie," Harry said, his voice trembling with fury. "I flew combat missions. I was shot at. I lost friends over there." Colbert leaned forward with predatory interest. "Oh, really? Names, Harry. Give us names of these fallen friends. Because my sources say you were kept so far from real combat that the biggest danger you faced was paper cuts from playing cards." The cruelty was breathtaking. Harry's jaw clenched as he fought to maintain composure, but his hands were shaking now. Behind the cameras, his security detail tensed, reading the warning signs they'd been trained to recognize. "You're sick," Harry whispered, his voice barely audible over the studio's sound system. "You're actually sick." But Colbert pressed his advantage, sensing total victory. "What's sick is pretending to be a war hero when you're nothing but a privileged tourist who wanted to play soldier. At least be honest about it." That was the breaking point. Harry's military training kicked in, not the ceremonial aspects, but the real combat instincts he'd developed under fire. His entire body coiled like a spring as he stepped closer to Colbert's desk. "Stand up," Harry commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led men into battle. "Stand up and say that to my face." Colbert remained seated, suddenly, realizing he might have pushed too far. The studio fell completely silent except for the mechanical whir of cameras still rolling. Even the production crew had stopped moving. "I'm sorry, are you threatening me?" Colbert asked, trying to inject humor into his voice but failing to hide his nervousness. "On my own show?" "I'm giving you a chance to apologize," Harry replied, his military bearing now fully on display. "One chance to take back what you just said about my service and my fallen comrades." Instead of backing down, Colbert made his fatal mistake. He laughed. "This is rich," he said, gesturing to his audience. "The fake prince is now playing fake soldier. What's next, Harry? Are you going to challenge me to a duel?" The laughter that followed from some audience members was nervous and forced. Most people in the studio could sense they were witnessing something genuinely dangerous, not entertainment. Harry's face transformed completely. Gone was any trace of the affable royal who had walked onto the stage. In his place stood someone who had genuinely faced death and watched friends die. The change was so dramatic that several audience members in the front row instinctively moved back. "You want to know about real service?" Harry said, his voice now deadly quiet. "I'll tell you about real service. I'll tell you about holding my friend's hand while he bled out from an IED explosion." I'll tell you about the nightmares I still have about the helicopter crashes I survived. I'll tell you about coming home to find photographers camped outside. Military hospitals trying to get pictures of wounded soldiers for their tabloids. Each word landed like a physical blow. The studio was so quiet that the air conditioning seemed deafening. But you wouldn't understand any of that, Harry continued, moving closer to Colbert's desk, because you've never risked anything real. You've never put your life on the line for anyone. You just sit behind this desk making jokes about people who have. Colbert's confidence finally cracked completely. He looked to his producers for help, but they were frozen, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the drama play out. "Harry, I think we should," Colbert began, but Harry cut him off. "No, we're not done. You wanted to talk about my service, so let's talk about it. Let's talk about the 25 confirmed kills I made from my helicopter. Let's talk about the Taliban fighters who won't be going home to their families because of missions I flew. Is that heroic enough for you, Stephen?" The admission sent shockwaves through the studio. Harry had never publicly discussed specific combat details, and the raw honesty of it was devastating. Several audience members looked physically ill. Colbert finally seemed to realize the magnitude of his mistake, but his ego wouldn't let him back down completely. "Look, I was just—" "You were just what?" Harry demanded, now standing directly beside Colbert's desk. "Just trying to humiliate me for your audience's entertainment? Just trying to diminish the sacrifice of every person who served alongside me?" The confrontation had reached a crescendo that no one in the studio had expected. Security guards stationed around the studio's perimeter began moving closer, their hands instinctively hovering near their radios. The head of Harry's protection detail made subtle hand signals to his team, preparing for multiple scenarios. In the control room, producers frantically debated whether to cut the live feed, but the ratings were skyrocketing by the minute. Colbert, sweating now under the studio lights and pressure, made one final desperate attempt to regain control of his show. "Harry, you're clearly upset, and I understand that, but threatening a talk show host on live television isn't exactly threatening." Harry's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You think I'm threatening you? Stephen, if I were threatening you, you'd know it. What I'm doing is giving you one last opportunity to show some basic human decency." The audience was completely silent now, many people holding their breath. The tension was so thick it felt suffocating. Even the camera operators seemed afraid to move, creating an eerie stillness broken only by the low hum of broadcasting equipment. But, instead of taking the olive branch Harry had offered, Colbert's wounded ego drove him to make the worst decision of his career. His voice took on a mocking, sing-song quality that made everyone in the studio cringe. "Oh, I see. So now you're the victim again. Poor Prince Harry. Everyone's always picking on you. First it was the mean old media. Then it was your own family. Now it's little old me. When does the victim tour end, Your Highness?" The words hung in the air like poison gas. Harry's entire body went rigid, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The transformation was visible to everyone watching. This was no longer a man trying to maintain composure. This was someone who had been pushed past every reasonable limit. "My victim tour?" Harry repeated slowly, his voice so quiet the microphones barely picked it up. "You want to talk about victims? Let's talk about my mother, who died fleeing photographers just like the ones you probably employ for your show's research. Let's talk about my wife, who contemplated suicide because of the harassment your industry considers entertainment." Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to inflict maximum damage. Colbert's face began to pale as he realized he had wandered into territory far more dangerous than celebrity gossip. Harry continued relentlessly. "Let's talk about the veterans who trusted me with their stories, their trauma, their pain, only to have people like you mock their experiences for cheap laughs. That's what victims look like, Stephen. Real victims, not comedians having their feelings hurt." The studio audience was now openly uncomfortable. many people shifting in their seats or looking toward the exits. What had started as entertainment had become something ugly and deeply personal. Several audience members were visibly distressed, some wiping away tears. Colbert, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage, made his final catastrophic error. With a nervous laugh that sounded more like a sob, he said, "Well, at least you're consistent. Running away from problems seems to be your specialty, doesn't it? First you ran from royal duty, then you ran from Britain, and now you'll probably run from this interview too." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the audio technicians seemed to have stopped breathing. Harry stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, processing what had just been said. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of absolute finality. "You know what, Stephen? You're absolutely right about one thing. I am going to run from this interview, because staying here one more second would mean legitimizing what you've done tonight, and I won't do that." Harry turned toward the audience, his voice rising to address them directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this. You came here expecting entertainment, and instead you got to watch someone's character assassination in real time." The audience began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Many people stood up, creating a wave of support that rippled through the studio. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out everything else. Colbert watched in horror as his own audience turned against him. His face cycled through emotions, confusion, anger, desperation, and finally, devastating realization of what he had done. The applause wasn't stopping. If anything, it was getting louder. Harry nodded to the audience with dignity, then turned back to Colbert one final time. "This is what happens when you mistake cruelty for comedy, Stephen. This is what happens when you forget that the people you're mocking are human beings with real pain, real trauma, and real consequences to your words." The applause continued as Harry began removing his microphone with steady hands. His movements were precise and controlled, every action radiating the disciplined calm of someone who had made peace with their decision. Colbert made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Harry, wait. I think we can work this out. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot, but—" Harry paused in his microphone removal and looked directly into Colbert's eyes. "No, Stephen, we can't work this out. Because what you've revealed tonight isn't a misunderstanding or a bad joke. It's who you really are when the cameras are rolling and you think you have power over someone." The words landed with devastating accuracy. Around the studio, crew members were openly staring at Colbert, with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. His own team was looking at him like they'd never seen him before. Harry finished removing his microphone and set it carefully on Colbert's desk. The gesture was deliberate and final, a symbolic end to any pretense of professional courtesy. "This interview is over," Harry announced, his voice carrying across the stunned studio with military authority. The words weren't spoken in anger anymore, but with the cold finality of someone who had reached an irreversible decision. Colbert, panic now evident in his eyes, scrambled to his feet. "Harry, please, we can edit this out. We can start over. My producers will—" "Your producers," Harry interrupted, looking directly at the control room windows, "should be ashamed of themselves for allowing this to continue. Every single person in this building who let this happen shares responsibility for what occurred here tonight." The accusations sent shockwaves through the production staff. In the control room, several producers exchanged guilty glances. They had indeed let the confrontation continue far beyond acceptable limits, mesmerized by the skyrocketing ratings and the spectacle unfolding before them. Harry turned back to face the studio audience, who were still on their feet applauding. He raised his hand, and the applause gradually died down to respectful silence. "I want to say something to everyone watching at home," Harry began, his voice steady and clear. "What you witnessed tonight is exactly why my wife and I stepped away from public life in Britain. This kind of systematic cruelty, this weaponization of personal trauma for entertainment, it's not acceptable anywhere, from anyone. The cameras, still rolling live, captured every word as Harry delivered what amounted to a devastating indictment of tabloid culture and exploitative media practices. Mr. Colbert has shown you what happens when someone believes their platform gives them the right to dehumanize others. He's shown you what happens when cruelty is packaged as comedy. And most importantly, he's shown you why we must demand better. From our media. Colbert, still standing behind his desk, looked increasingly desperate. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he realized the magnitude of the career-ending disaster unfolding around him. Harry, I was just doing my job. This is comedy. It's supposed to push boundaries. No, Harry cut him off sharply. Your job is to entertain people, not to traumatize them. Your job is to use your platform responsibly, not to weaponize it against guests who trusted you with their time and their stories. The studio audience erupted in another wave of applause, this time mixed with calls of agreement. Someone shouted, "That's right!" from the back of the studio, and others joined in with supportive comments. Harry waited for the noise to subside, then delivered his final blow. "Stephen, you had the opportunity tonight to interview someone who has served his country, lost his mother to media harassment, and dedicated his life to helping veterans and other vulnerable people. Instead, you chose to mock military service, dismiss racism, and make light of suicide. That says everything anyone needs to know about your character." The words landed like a sledgehammer. Colbert visibly flinched, his face cycling through expressions of shock, shame, and desperate regret. Around the studio, crew members who had worked with him for years looked at him with undisguised disappointment. Harry began walking toward the exit, his security detail falling into formation around him, but he paused at the edge of the stage and turned back one final time. To the veterans watching tonight, your service matters. Your sacrifices are real. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. His voice carried genuine emotion as he continued. To anyone who has faced racism, harassment, or discrimination, your experiences are valid. You deserve better than what you witnessed here tonight. The applause that followed was thunderous and sustained. The entire studio audience was on their feet again, many people openly crying. Even some of the crew members were applauding, their professional neutrality completely abandoned. As Harry reached the studio exit, one final moment of drama unfolded. Colbert, in a last desperate attempt, called out across the studio, "Harry, Your Highness, please!" Harry stopped but didn't turn around. Without looking back, he said clearly enough for the microphones to pick up, "My name is Henry. I'm a husband, a father, and a veteran. I don't need a title to have dignity, Stephen. But apparently you need one to show respect." With that, Prince Harry walked out of the studio, his security team flanking him as the doors closed behind them with finality. The studio fell into chaos immediately. Audience members were talking loudly among themselves, many expressing outrage at what they had witnessed. Several people were demanding refunds or asking how to file complaints. Others were already posting on social media, sharing videos they had secretly recorded on their phones. Colbert stood alone behind his desk, facing an audience that had completely turned against him. The applause had stopped, replaced by angry murmurs and the sound of people gathering their belongings to leave early. In the control room, producers frantically tried to decide whether to continue the show or cut to emergency programming. The phone lines were already lighting up with calls from advertisers threatening to pull their sponsorships. The few audience members who hadn't already left continued to glare at Colbert with open hostility. One elderly veteran in the front row stood up and removed his military cap, holding it over his heart as a gesture of respect for Harry's service, and disgust at how it had been mocked. Within hours, the confrontation had exploded across social media platforms worldwide. Dinosaur's respect for service began trending, along with Nakusha Colbert disgrace and Nakusha stand with Harry. Video clips of the most damaging moments were shared millions of times, each one making Colbert look worse than the last. The entertainment industry's reaction was swift and brutal. Fellow comedians distanced themselves from Colbert's behavior, while veterans' organizations issued statements condemning the interview. CBS's phone lines were overwhelmed with complaints, and advertisers began pulling out en masse. By morning, Stephen Colbert's reputation lay in ruins, destroyed by his own cruelty and arrogance. The man who had thought himself untouchable behind his desk had learned the hardest lesson of his career: that dignity and respect aren't privileges to be granted by hosts, but rights that every human being deserves, regardless of their title or status.